I wanted to take some time to share with you a wild tale from my recent vacation. Lots of people associate Florida with beaches and theme parks, but the swamps, especially the Everglades, are a hidden gem, in my opinion. About 6 months ago, in late summer, I took a trip down there with my friends. Eager to escape our routine lives, we were more drawn to the wilderness areas than a theme park atmosphere. So, we decided to sign up for a guided tour of the Everglades. We looked forward to the airboats and the chance to see something that we wouldn't normally see back home, like an alligator or something like that. On the day of our tour, the sun was out as we sped across the vast marshes of the Everglades. We were thrilled when we saw gators basking on the banks, their eyes just above the water. It was quite a sight. Perhaps an hour into our journey, right at sunset when the darkness was quickly descending upon the swamp, the boat's engine seemed to make a crazy noise, and then it sputtered and died. At first we thought it was a joke, but the look on our guide's face and the expletives coming from his mouth quickly told us otherwise. We city folk were definitely out of our element. Our guide, Gus, tried to calm us, saying it was a minor issue he'd handled before. Now, without the boat's motor humming in the background, the swamp was eerily silent, broken only by occasional splashes. We all looked around, trying to keep our minds preoccupied as Gus worked on the engine. Obviously, we were all totally clueless about the situation we were about to find ourselves in. As the night truly began to set in, the swamp sounds came alive. In the newly quiet surroundings, every noise seemed heightened. The stillness gave the swamp a weird and scary heaviness. Silly or not, we all agreed that we felt very vulnerable for some reason. Suddenly, a loud splash echoed in the water not too far from us. I can't tell you the exact size of whatever made the splash, but it wasn't a small critter. This wasn't a regular splash from a fish or even a gator. It felt deliberate. My eyes strained in the low light, searching for any sign of what made the splash. But the swamp gave up no secrets. Our guide Gus, meanwhile, continued his repairs oblivious to our growing anxiety. We felt trapped, like sitting ducks. Unfamiliar with the swamp's rules, we talked amongst ourselves, sharing that we all were feeling nervous. As for what was happening out there, that was something we couldn't figure out. Just as we thought things couldn't get any worse, a rumbling sound echoed in the swamp. The sound was deep, and then came crunching noises as if something heavy was making its way closer. I hissed Gus's name, hoping he had heard it too. But he was already busy with the engine, muttering curses. Panicking, I looked around, straining my eyes. As the moon peeked through the clouds, it illuminated the reality, revealing 2 piercing yellow eyes staring back from the bushes. It was obvious that they weren't a gator's eyes. Then my uncomfortable feeling turned into absolute horror when I saw a dark, massive figure moving behind the vegetation. The silhouette was chilling. A humanoid figure, tall as a tree, that seemed to be standing on 2 legs. It was draped in shadows, but I could make out the overall structure, which was vaguely human. Its head looked similar to a dinosaur or a lizard, complete with what seemed like sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight. Our frantic whispers and panicked movements finally got Gus's attention. He looked up, a puzzled expression crossing his face before his eyes widened in sheer terror. Seeing the usually gruff Gus frightened really hit it home for us, but he seemed to recover quickly, urging us to keep quiet while he popped open compartment under the wheel and grabbed a shotgun. Meanwhile, the reptilian creature prowled on the edge of our visibility, almost toying with us. Strangely enough, it didn't approach the boat, but that didn't help the terror we felt knowing that we couldn't escape if we needed to. Gus finally managed to restart the engine, and he quickly and expertly steered us away from the horrible creature. Even when we got back to civilization, the encounter still felt unreal, and Gus? He remained tight-lipped, dismissing our questions with grunts, making it obvious that he didn't want to talk about it. Everyone went back to their routines, but something had changed. Our illusion of a safe and mundane life had been shattered. Even now, every time I hear a bump in the night or a rustling in the bushes, I am back in that broken-down boat, watching the menacing glow of those yellow eyes against the Everglades. I may never truly know what was coming at us that night, but it's clear that we were merely guests and that the creature was 100% in charge. So this was the summer of 2012, and I was working on an archaeological dig in South Dakota's Badlands National Park. The Badlands are wild and untamed. As for me, I'm passionate about exploring history, particularly how ancient findings can shed light on our present world. The dig was a joint project between several universities, focused on a region of sediments rich in Ice Age fossils. Days consisted of long, hot hours chipping away at the hardened silt, but the rewards could be spectacular. Revealing the petrified remains of a mammoth, a camel, or maybe a prehistoric bear catapulted you right to the Ice Age. One evening, as the sun was setting, the stretching shadows across the Badlands turned the landscape almost alien. Beyond the fossils, the Badlands possess a raw beauty. For me, there's something about that intense isolation that's incredibly alluring. The park is isolated and desolate in a way that's hard to explain unless you've been there. We were miles from the nearest town, in a wilderness of stone and wind. As the crew went about their nightly routines of cataloging the day's findings and preparing for the next day, I remember telling them I'd stay back to finish up documenting a particularly intriguing find. A partial skull had been unearthed near the edge of our designated dig site, and I was engrossed in trying to determine its age and species. By the time I'd finished, the twilight had deepened into full-on darkness, except for the dig lights giving off a bit of a glow. I felt compelled to stay outside and enjoy the silence a bit longer. The only sounds were the rustle of wind, the distant call of a night bird, the occasional eerie creak of settling rock formations. That night, an unusual quietness hung in the air, a quiet so profound that I couldn't help but feel uneasy. As I stood there in the night's strangeness, I started to register a faint, not quite normal sound, like a muted clicking or a clattering, almost rhythmic but irregular. It was something unfamiliar, coming from deep within the ground, moving closer. And that's when I had my first sense that something out of the ordinary was about to take place. The rhythm was erratic, foreign to any patterns I recognized from my time in the Badlands. In the silent night, it took me a few moments to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. The sound resonated from the spot where I'd unearthed the partial skull earlier. Out of a bold curiosity that we archaeologists sometimes possess, I decided to investigate. Why? I guess I was hoping some lost Ice Age critter had crawled into the hole to escape the chill of night. I couldn't have expected what came next. I took a flashlight and began my descent into the hole. My flashlight revealed shifting shadows on the sedimentary rock. And then, as I dug deeper into the stifling darkness, I saw it. At first glance, I was captivated. A gaunt figure hunched over and crawling at the edge of my flashlight beam. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. No less than 6 feet tall if it stood upright. Its skin was an unsettling shade of pallor, almost shimmering under the harsh beam of my flashlight. Naked, crawling on all fours, it moved with a horrifying blend of primal prowess and human-like agility. Its face was eerily human, yet obscenely distorted, large eyes glistening against a face devoid of a nose or mouth. The sight filled me with a mix of awe, curiosity, and fear. The moment our eyes locked, the creature emitted a guttural clicking noise, a sound I'll never forget. That ear-splitting sound echoed around, making bile rise in my throat, the dread finally pushing me back to my senses. With every ounce of willpower, I turned and scrambled back up, desperate to outpace the creature. I could hear it moving below, the sound of clicking growing distant as I distanced myself from the hole. Back at our temporary camp, with my heart still racing, I looked back at the shadows surrounding the dig site. After several tense moments, there was no sign of the creature I started calling the crawler. Slowly, the serene night began to feel ordinary again, the previous events disappearing as if they were a dream. Did I imagine it all? Such encounters can make you question your sanity. The next day, I found no sign of the crawler, just an archaeologist's marker and a partially excavated skull in a dusty pit. Despite my nerves, I couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. The crawler, this creature existing between reality and myth, is something that challenges our established scientific paradigms. It keeps me awake at night sometimes, wondering about the tunnels that might exist beneath our feet. So, that's my account. An experience so surreal, it feels like it's completely made up. But it isn't. I can't help but believe there are more mysteries waiting below the ground we walk on. It began on a hot day in Arches National Park in Utah. I had set out on my latest photography assignment for the magazine I worked for, tasked with capturing the famous rock formations against the backdrop of a sunset. I remember that it was July 25th of 2018. Photography is not just about images for me, but the stories they tell. Arches National Park, with its tall sandstone formations and unending skyline, felt like the perfect place for the image I wanted. That day, each photo I took was coming out perfectly, and then I started looking for a place for my sunset photo. I set up my tripod and adjusted my camera for the shifting shadows and colors. I moved between locations, capturing wide-range shots for the magazine and tight shots to highlight the fading sun on the rock formations. As the brilliant orange colors of the sunset gave way to darkness, I noticed an unsettling silence, the kind that made me stop and look around. However, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, and so I pressed on, trying to focus on getting the photo, attributing the sense of unease to the creeping darkness. But unfortunately, the beauty of my surroundings was becoming overshadowed by a growing unease and urgency to finish up. Now I could hardly make out the outlines of the arches from where I stood, and the once vibrant red rocks were now silhouettes against the darkening sky. Just as I was wrapping up, I heard a sound, a low rumble that echoed hauntingly from the darkness. My heart raced, sensing danger. With my hands trembling, I scanned the horizon with my headlamp, desperately trying to make sense of what I was sensing and hearing. The beam of my light eventually landed on a reflection of two yellow dots illuminated in the distance. From what I could make out, there was an elongated silhouette standing upright behind them, broad-shouldered and hunched. There was a putrid smell in the air now, too, dank and revolting. It hit my nostrils and lingered unpleasantly. I strained my ears to make out any more sounds, and amidst the eerie silence, there came another growl, a deep, rumbling snarl, more aggressive and terrifying this time. I now realized the gravity of the situation. There I was in the fading twilight, alone and facing something unnatural. The shifting shadows and stone silhouettes seemed to play tricks on my eyes. Yet, on a nearby ridge, I noticed something that drew my attention, something different from the rest of the scenery. Peering through the viewfinder, my eyes drifted to a dark spot against the dark sky. A silhouette stood out against the dusky backdrop. It was tall, on its hind legs, resembling a large canine. I couldn't believe it. Was I really seeing what I thought I was? A cryptid from the stories of my youth? As my trembling finger pressed the camera shutter, the creature standing atop the ridge became visible in its full, terrifying glory on the screen. It stood there, observing me. 8 feet tall at least, with powerful thighs and muscular arms ending in elongated paws with long claws. Its fur had uneven patches, giving it a wild and mysterious look. As I focused, I saw a scarred snout, coarse facial hair, and a hint of a snarl. The silence broke with a howl that echoed in the valley. It sounded like a distress call and a stark warning all at once. Despite every instinct telling me to flee, I remained rooted, watching the creature through my viewfinder. I knew that I needed to document this. I took continuous shots as the creature paced the ridge nervously, its glowing eyes never losing sight of me. Suddenly, in an explosion of energy, it was gone, leaving nothing but echoes of that frightful howl in its wake. The moment passed, and I was left gasping, my heart racing. With trembling hands, I packed my gear, and the ride back was a blur. For the next few days, I couldn't help but revisit the events in a loop, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. The putrid smell of decay and something sour from the encounter clung to me. It was the hardest part of it to forget. Never a believer of the cryptid folklore, that encounter turned me into one. It made me question what I thought was real and what wasn't. It pushed me into a corner I never knew existed. Maybe we dismiss these stories as adults, as a way to cope with the unknown. But here I am, sharing an experience that many might find hard to believe. Yet I lived those moments, witnessed something that most people haven't. Sometimes, reality and myth are two halves of the same coin, and dismissing one robs the other of its complete understanding. A couple of years ago, I went on a canoeing trip in the boundary waters of Minnesota. I was looking forward to an enjoyable time, but to my surprise, this trip took an unexpected turn. The day began just like any other, clear and bright, perfect for a paddle. My Labrador, Finn, was with me too. We started without a fixed destination, just looking to enjoy the journey. But soon I began to question my route choice. It seemed surreal, and eventually we ended up approaching an island that looked desolate. I have always been of the belief that when you veer off course, you're simply carving a new one, but reaching that secluded island was way out of my prediction for what we'd get into that day. Upon stepping foot on the island, I felt the strangest sensation, like déjà vu layered with a foreboding chill. Initially, curiosity took hold. It was desolate but beautiful, and before long I started noticing strange markings or ancient symbols. Seeing them on tree barks and rock surfaces was both fascinating and unsettling. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake getting out of the boat and onto the island. However, I decided to explore the island a bit further. Finn was content, which made me less nervous, and so I ventured out, armed only with a utility knife, flashlight, and a full canister of bear spray. It was during this further exploration, though, that I noticed something else. Or rather, it was a kind of a feeling and not something I actually saw. I spun around, half expecting to see something, but I didn't know what. Still, I saw nothing. That was only the beginning. The air felt thicker, almost heavy. I heard distant sounds in the quiet woods, occasional growls and huffs. But every time I thought I had determined the direction it came from, it would change. That's when I smelled it. It was putrid, like something left in the sun for weeks. It encompassed the entire area, making me gag. A loud knock broke the island's silence, followed by echoing grunts. It dawned on me. I wasn't alone here. Just as the horrifying stench hit me, a shadow shifted in the brush, a movement that was big. Too big. I felt my stomach start to churn. Peering into the woods, I met two sunken, piercing eyes. What I saw next, I almost wish I hadn't. A massive figure slowly stepped out from the shadows into the air, clearly revealing itself. It stood at a daunting height with a hefty build. With robust muscles, it looked insanely strong. My gaze was drawn to its face. A jutting, heavy jaw framed by a pronounced forehead and bulbous temples, perfectly symmetrical, but grotesquely unlike any human. The foliage masked parts of its body, but there was no mistaking the formidable creature for anything natural, a Sasquatch. There was absolutely no way. Not out here, right? The very idea seemed laughably impossible. I turned quickly and gasped. Finn was by my side in an instant. I knew he could feel my fear. The creature let out one last, deep, piercing snarl. It was a warning, clear as day. Leave, and leave we did. Grunting noises followed us as we rushed back to our canoe. Surprisingly, Finn didn't hold back, and he hurried back without any issues. We paddled away from the island. Both of us had our eyes fixed on the dense tree line until it was out of sight. The unfamiliar noise and the echoes from earlier played in my mind. For a while after the trip, I struggled to even accept the reality of what I'd seen on that island. I told myself the solitude had gotten to me, but I couldn't forget the pungent smell and the intense fear. The strange markings that I had found earlier seemed to suggest that people had come across that place before me. I tried to connect the dots to figure out what had happened, but all that happened was I became more confused. The question remained, had I truly seen a Sasquatch? When I close my eyes, the creature I remember seeing is eerily humanoid in its features, but also animalistic and beast-like. Some nights, especially when the wind howls, the echoes sound eerily like the grunts from the island. I take a shuddered breath, reminding myself I'm miles away in the safety of my city. My harrowing, unexplained brush with what I believe was a Sasquatch. Take it from a seasoned adventurer. The wilderness nurtures mysteries that we may never understand. The Eastern State Penitentiary isn't a place to take lightly. I learned that firsthand. A couple of years back on Halloween night, my college buddies and I wanted to scare ourselves. Our dare was for one of us to spend a night in the penitentiary, an ancient, abandoned prison known for ghostly encounters. Studying at Penn State, I had heard many horrifying stories about this place. So why did I agree to be the one to stay? Well, mostly out of curiosity and a bit of stupid bravado. Also, I was a skeptic, always wanting proof. So I was more excited than scared, a bit naive, I guess. At twilight, my buddies dropped me off in front of the prison's looming stone walls. A chilly wind blew fallen leaves around my feet. I glanced at the ancient prison with a strange mix of excitement, anticipation, and, I admit it now, a tinge of fear. Stepping inside felt like going back in time. The entire place emanated an eerie, foreboding aura. I could sense the people of its past as I moved from cell to cell looking in. The Eastern State Penitentiary is vast, with decaying cell blocks radiating out from a central hub. Each cell reminded me of its notorious history. As the night grew darker, the gloom within the prison seemed to heighten, and the temperature appeared to drop lower than what I would expect for a late October evening. Wandering through this decayed prison, I thought about the legends and ghost stories I'd heard. I wondered about the intense emotions that must have been experienced by countless inmates who populated these cells. Pain, anguish, desperation, regret. Many of them had spent their final living hours within these stone and iron tombs. To distract myself, I imagined the prison in its prime, the echoes of heavy iron doors swinging open and shut, the formless murmurs of guards and prisoners, the occasional clang of metal chains, the disquieting stillness during lights out. As time passed, every echo set me on edge. I told myself the scurrying noises were just rats. Even the wind seemed to conspire, its wails morphing into tormented cries when squeezed through the narrow windows. My skin prickled, and despite wanting to dismiss it as irrational, I had a growing sensation of being watched. I kept glancing into random cells as an instinctive reaction, half expecting to see something or someone. I couldn't help but feel nervous. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep in the central hub, flashlight beside me. But it wasn't long until I awoke with a start. I felt a cold rush, an unnatural stillness, and the distinct feeling of my heart pounding against my chest. My flashlight barely lit the thick darkness when I shone it around. This was where things took a terrifying turn, making it a night I'd never forget. From here on, everything felt surreal, almost dreamlike, but it was all too real. I was about to have an encounter that defied explanation. Suddenly, an odd smell had me wrinkling my nose. It was a distinct scent, so out of place in the confines of the desolate prison. It was the distinct smell of tobacco and a faint undertone of cheap liquor. Just then, my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows around. I began to shiver uncontrollably. The sudden drop in temperature felt out of place on a normal night. A murmur drifted to me, the words impossible to decipher, layered underneath the echo of my pounding heartbeat. The sound was distant yet eerily close, too real for my already tense mind. It was accompanied by the subtle clink and drag of what I could only imagine as heavy rusted chains. Everything felt so unreal that I was completely dazed. Jumping to my feet, I swiveled around. I pushed back my rising panic. I gasped as I noticed something, or someone, unusual. Hovering just beyond my light was a vaguely humanoid form, a sinister, wispy, almost translucent shadow. What I could see were hollow crevices where eyes should have belonged, emitting a faint glow. As the gut-wrenching realization of an actual apparition hit me, I felt an intense fear, a paralysis that stopped me from reacting. I shouted, the sound echoing in the silence, my own voice ricocheting around the stone walls. I didn't know whether to confront the entity or run, but my instinct to survive chose running, and so I took off. Stumbling through the maze-like prison, I felt a presence behind me. Whispers grew louder, chains seemed closer, and the cold got colder. A deep groan echoed through the corridors, sounding like restless spirits. Somehow, I managed to steer clear and hid myself in an abandoned cell until dawn. The morning sun filtered through the prison bars and a bit of my sanity returned. As I stumbled out, my buddies bombarded me with questions. I stuttered a nonsensical response, my mind still trying to understand the night's horrifying encounter and how to find the words to talk about it. That dare still haunts me. Often I wake up at night, haunted by the sounds of that night. Let's just say that it's no surprise that none of my friends ever took up that dare for themselves. And so here I am, the only one of us who really knows what exists in those horrible, cold hallways.